Now we're ready to retouch the second still from our photo shoot for Tower 28. And we know that this image is going to be an Instagram story, and an Instagram story is typically a 9:16. But before we get into the crops and the guides like we did in the last still, I want to make sure that all of my lines are clean. As you know, we had fixed all of this in Lightroom, but it's always good to double check and make sure that things are correct. So I'm going to go ahead and start dragging some guides from the top. And I'm just making sure to drag along all of the lines that I have in my image, including the props, the backdrop, all of that. And so I can already tell that there's a little bit of crookedness, in some of these props, and that's okay. We're going to fix them right now. First thing that I like to do is I'm going to grab the entire image. So I hit transform, and then I typically like to go between skew, distort, and warp. So right now I'm going to start with skew. I'm going to drag some of these guys down here, bring this up here. I'm looking at this little line right here that I want to fix. I'm also going to bring this over. And I'm just making little fine adjustments because I don't want to make anything drastic. And I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to go ahead and take a look at my edges again. That's looking pretty good. This side and this side here is looking good. And the horizon line is not the best, so I'm going to bring this down a little bit more. And I'm going to do that using the warp tool here. Now I'm pretty happy with that, so let's move on. And of course, as you can see, there's a little bit of the white space here from transforming the image. And so now let's get to the actual crop, because I know that this is going to be a 9:16. And so I don't really need to be retouching anything outside of that. So let's go ahead and clear our guides for now. And I'm going to grab this crop tool. And here's where you can see how much of the image I actually won't be even touching at all. And as you can see, we were careful not to crop out this squiggle. I wanted to make sure that this was still intact, but I'm not too worried about this one down here being cropped out. So I'm okay going up a little bit, as long as there's more of the top, I believe. So now that I'm happy with that crop, let's go ahead and just drag in our guides to the edge. And I'm going to go ahead and cancel the crop. And now I know that all I need to do is stay within this area right here as I'm retouching. And so the first thing that I want to do is I will duplicate this layer. And I'm going to go ahead and call it clean. I'm going to use the polygonal lasso tool to fill this part here, the white part. I'm going to right click and use the fill, the content aware option, and see if it can guess what I want it to do. Yep, there we go. That looks good. Okay, I'm going to make sure here at the bottom as well. And I'm not too worried about this section right here since I'm going to eventually end up cropping it out anyway. But I do want to make sure that everything is filled here. So I'm going to zoom in really closely, make sure that it all looks good. All right, so now let's get into all of the retouching. So of course, in this particular image, we have a lot more retouching to do, not only on the props, but on the products, as well as really matching the colors of the brand of Tower 28. So I have here this layer of their branding colors like I showed you last time. As you can see, this really lilac light purple is meant to be this color. Unfortunately, we couldn't find the right color for this lilac color. And so we will probably end up retouching it and brightening it up and getting as close as possible to their brand colors. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that. And we also have to do some retouching on the background, on the ground here. We also have to smooth out the edges of the squiggles here, like in the last image, fix the coloring of the background, and do some dodging and burning and sharpening and all of that. So let's get started on retouching all of the dust and imperfections first. So now that I'm retouching some of the products, we want to make sure that we're getting all of those details like I had mentioned in the previous still that we were working on. And one other thing too that I'm noticing, and we'll get to it at some point, but I want to mention that the hard light that we were working with, was creating this reflection here. And so I'm going to show you how I can remove that and make it less distracting. And as you can tell too, as this specific product is laid down flat, it may seem like there's not as much product inside, and so I'm going to also fix that as well. One thing to know about retouching some products too that are leaning or are placed in a certain way using earthquake putty, that you want to make sure that you remember to remove that in post as well. Sometimes it could look very subtle, but you definitely want to make sure that you remove that in post. The key to editing some of these products as well is to make fine little adjustments and sort of build on that versus trying to go over with a spot healing brush tool and expect that it's just going to magically work. You have to do little bits at a time, otherwise you can really overdo it and it'll look a little crazy. All right, so like I mentioned, I'm gonna do a combination of the stamp tool to sort of make this lip gloss look like it's full. Just going really soft here on the edge so as to not make it look strange. Here's where it's going to get a little tricky, and we have to do a little bit of troubleshooting to see what's going to work best. But essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to start slowly using the stamp tool to get rid of this harsh light reflection. Because the texture inside of the lip glosses are essentially the same, on the other lip glosses. Sometimes what I like to do to keep the texture uniform, because you can tell that I've been using the stamp tool here. It's very noticeable. And maybe you might not see this in Instagram story, of course, but it's always good to practice fine detailing. And so I like to just grab this whole section, use the patch tool to get that same texture that I want. And you have to be careful to not accidentally get something that you don't want. Now I want to fix the texture though, because now you can tell that it's very obviously clone stamped. So I'm going to try a few different things. Sometimes I like to see what it would look like with different texture in there, and sometimes it looks a lot better too. So now that we have finished retouching our props and our products, let's go ahead and move on to retouching our backdrop. And we'll first get rid of some of the imperfections and, some of the little dusts and grooves on the particle board, and we'll then focus on the squiggles. I'm going to be using pretty much the same tools that I've been using in the previous still and in this, which is the spot healing brush tool, the stamp tool, and the patch tool. And I'll also be using the same old dust and scratches tool. And one other thing that I just noticed as well is that the Tower 28 lip gloss here for this one is just a little bit further down. We must have, not rotated the lip gloss bottle enough. And so I'm going to be using a little bit of Photoshop magic to sort of bring this up a little bit more. So let's go ahead and do that right now. I'll go ahead and select what it is that I'll be moving. And this is why it's important to make sure that you get everything as much as possible in camera instead of trying to fix it later in post, because it definitely makes a difference. And now I'm going to use a little layer mask here. I'm going to start using a black brush, starting to mask out the parts of this cutout that I don't want. And it's not going to be perfect, but for the most part, we want to get it close enough. And now I'm going to go ahead and merge that down and just fix this edge right here. And something that I like to do when I need a little bit of noise is select, noise, add noise. That looks much better. but I still want to get a little bit more texture here. So for this little horizon line here, I'm just going to grab the selection tool here and going to select and mask, smooth out that selection. And I'm just going to grab another part right here, copy and paste. I'm going to move it here below just so we can get that nice straight line here. And same thing on the other side. I'm going to use the stamp tool to keep this uniform. And one other thing that I notice here in the shadow, you can tell that there's a little bit of a blue tint here that I don't necessarily want. So I'm going to go ahead and just select this little area right here, a little shadowed area, and I'm going to go select and mask, up the radius here, smooth it out, feather it out. I'm going to hit layer, adjustment layer, and hue saturation. And I'm just going to go to the cyans, bring down the saturation, see if it might bring down the blues a little bit. I'm going to select blues. And I'm going to desaturate in the master layer right here. Yeah. So I'm going to grab a really soft brush and now just paint in a little bit of this here. Now we've got most of our background cleaned up now, and now we're going to move towards fixing the squiggles. There's a few ways that we can do this, but I think the best way that we can make them as clean as possible is if I just use the curvature tool and select it, get a really nice clean line, and make it bigger. So here's what I'm going to do. So first of all, I'm going to clean up a little bit of the texture here. I'm going to go ahead and grab my curvature tool. I'm going to start outlining the curves here. And since I'm making several points, I'm able to essentially go back and adjust some of the points if I feel that they need to be adjusted. Now I'm not being perfect with it because, like I mentioned, I'm going to making this a little bit bigger. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and make a selection out of that. And I'm going to select and mask. I'm going to smooth out that selection, maybe feather it a tiny little bit. And I'm going to press copy and paste. And like I mentioned, I'm going to be making this a little bit bigger. So now I'm going to use the distort tool.